Thank you again, Lance. And I appreciate all the wonderful speakers so far. I'm really looking forward to this session. This is session number 4, Consciousness of Abstracting. And our first speaker is Svetlana here. Our first speaker is Svetlana here. I didn't see her anywhere.
I saw her earlier.
I don't see her right now. So I guess we'll just move forward, and if she approaches, we'll add her on to the end. Does that sound okay? So for the speakers, or I think
here she is. She's coming.
Okay, here we go. I'm assuming that people are aware we're going to try to keep it to 15 minutes. I will send you a personal message at 10, and I'll remind you if at 15 you're still going. I will ask you to wrap it up. And you say Svetlana is here in the.
Yana?
Hi, yes, I just joined. Thanks.
Okay, and it's so our first speaker is, it looks like Yana Grushina. Is that how you say your last name?
Yes.
And the title of her talk is Maps and Territories, General Semantics as a Framework for Understanding Political Rhetoric, and she is at Dartmouth College. And so it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Corey. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, if something happens while I speak, I may not be looking at the screen. Please give me an audible signal. So in our increasingly polarized political landscape, examining how political leaders navigate the distinction between language and reality, exemplified by Korzybski's famous dictum, "The map is not the territory," offers valuable insights into their effectiveness, worldviews, and ultimately impact. As communication scholars, students, teachers, practitioners, our engagement with the mechanisms of influence in political speech represents more than an academic exercise. I think it constitutes vital contribution to democratic citizenship and civic education. So there are several compelling reasons for why analyzing political speech deserves our sustained attention. One, political speech fundamentally shapes our shared reality. When political leaders speak, they don't merely describe the world, they actively construct it through language choices, framing, narrative. By analyzing how mechanisms like Burkean identification or Korzybski's concepts of abstraction and allness function in political rhetoric, we gain insight into how our collective understanding of reality is being shaped. And this awareness is essential in democracy, where citizens must evaluate competing claims about complex issues. Second, understanding mechanisms of influence enables critical engagement rather than passive consumption. Political speech is designed to persuade, often through processes that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. By making these mechanisms visible, whether they involve identification through division, the collapse of map territory distinctions, or two-valued orientation, we equip each other with the analytical tools to engage critically with persuasive messages. Also, our analysis of political speech reveals the relationship between language and power. Political rhetoric doesn't simply reflect existing power relations. Again, it helps constitute them. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, rhetorical analysis connects theory with lived experience. So when we apply concepts like identification, abstraction, or allness to contemporary political speech, we demonstrate the practical relevance of communication theory and general semantics for understanding everyday experience. This connection makes communication theory accessible and meaningful to students and citizens. So, at its core, general semantics examines how language shapes human perception and behavior. Korzybski proposed that many human conflicts and misunderstandings arise from confusion between our symbolic representations. President Obama's rhetorical style exemplifies several principles that general semantics would consider conducive to clear thinking and effective communication. His speeches consistently demonstrate abstraction consciousness, which is an awareness of the levels of abstraction in language and the limitations of our symbolic representations. So consider Obama's frequent use of nuance and qualification. In his 2009 speech in Cairo, Egypt, President Obama proposed a new beginning. Between the United States and Muslims around the world based upon mutual interest and mutual respect. So in the speech, he acknowledged, I quote, "No single speech can eradicate years of mistrust, nor can I answer in the time that I have this afternoon all the complex questions that brought us to this point. But I am convinced that in order to move forward, we must say openly to each other the things we hold in our hearts and that too often are said only behind closed doors. There must be a sustained effort to listen to each other, to learn from each other, to respect one another, and to seek common ground," end quote. So this statement recognized the limitations of language itself, a fundamental awareness that words alone cannot fully bridge divides or transform reality instantly. Obama's rhetoric also demonstrated sophisticated time binding, connecting historical narratives to present challenges and future possibilities, another foundational principle of general semantics. So Obama's frequent references to America's founding principles, civil rights struggles, and previous generations and current ones, sacrifices, created temporal continuity while acknowledging evolution and change. For example, elsewhere in the 2009 speech in Cairo, Obama stated, I quote, "I also know that Islam has always been a part of America's history. The first nation to recognize my country was Morocco. In signing the Treaty of Tripoli in 1796, our second president, John Adams, wrote, 'The United States has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims. And since our founding, American Muslims have enriched the United States,' end quote. So this approach aligns with Korzybski's view that human progress depends on our ability to reference, remember, acknowledge, and build upon accumulated knowledge across time. Also notably, Obama consistently avoided what Korzybski called allness, the assumption that our statements can capture all aspects of complex realities. So his characteristic phrases like on the one hand and on the other hand, and acknowledgement of multiple perspectives reflected an extensional orientation that recognized the complexity and multidimensionality of issues. In the same speech in Cairo, he stated, I quote, "There must be a sustained effort to listen to each other, to learn from each other, to respect one another. As the Holy Quran tells us, be conscious of God and speak always the truth. That is what I will try to do today, to speak the truth as best I can, humbled by the task before us, and firm in my belief that the interests we share as human beings are far more powerful than the forces that drive us apart," end quote. So now I want to turn to an analysis of rhetoric by a different president with a different approach to speech. So President Trump's communication style presents this distinct contrast when viewed through general semantics principles, whereas Obama's rhetoric often demonstrated abstraction consciousness, avoidance of allness, avoidance of ease of identity. Trump's approach frequently collapses the map territory distinction, presenting his verbal representations as direct, unmediated reality. And this is evident in Trump's frequent use of what Korzybski termed the is of identity, statements that equate the symbol with what it represents. His rhetoric exemplified this collapse of map and territory. Trump frequently employs what general semantics calls a two-valued orientation, a tendency to divide complex realities into binary oppositions, winners, losers, allies, enemies, success, failure. This approach, which Korzybski cautioned against, simplifies complex realities, but resonates powerfully with audiences seeking clarity in a complex world. For an illustrative example from another speech about a new beginning, consider these words from President Trump's 2025 inaugural address. And I quote, "We now have a government that cannot manage even a simple crisis at home, while at the same time stumbling into a continuing catalog of catastrophic events abroad. It fails to protect our magnificent law-abiding American citizens, but provides sanctuary and protection for dangerous criminals, many from prisons and mental institutions that have illegally entered our country from all over the world. We have a government that has given unlimited funding to the defense of foreign borders, but refuses to defend American borders, or more importantly, its own people." End quote. Interestingly, Trump's approach often displays an intentional orientation, defining reality, again, primarily through words and concepts, rather than through reference to observable phenomena. Elsewhere in the inaugural address, President Trump claimed, I quote, "We have an education system that teaches our children to be ashamed of themselves, in many cases to hate our country, despite the love that we try so desperately to provide to them. All of this will change starting today, and it will change very quickly." End quote. So some of this contrasting analysis presents us with a compelling paradox. General semantics emerged with normative aims, promoting clearer thinking, reducing conflict, and fostering more rational discourse. Yet this examination reveals that rhetorical approaches that violate its principles can be remarkably effective in political contexts, if effectiveness is reflected in audience support. So Korzybski would likely claim that this effectiveness is ultimately unsustainable. Language structures that do not correspond to the structure of reality eventually produce maladjustment. As Korzybski wrote, quote, "The language is like a map. It is not the territory represented, but it may be a good map or a bad map. If the map shows a different structure from the territory represented, then the map is worse than useless, as it misinforms and leads astray." I think the task for educators and citizens is to understand the appeal of this rhetoric, not merely dismiss it, and develop more sophisticated evaluative frameworks that recognize both its effectiveness and potential consequences for our collective ability to address complex realities. This is where a different concept of identification, one discussed by Kenneth Burke, an influential 20th century philosopher and rhetorician whose work resonates today, is revelatory. Burke recognized that persuasion works through identification, which, in his rhetorical theory, occurs when the speakers identify their ways with the audience's ways. To quote Burke on identification, "You persuade a man only insofar as you can talk his language by speech, gesture, tonality, order, image, attitude, idea, identifying your ways with his." So for Burke, then, identification is a positive rhetorical mechanism that enables persuasion. He wrote, "A is not identical with his colleague B, but insofar as their interests are joined, A is identified with B." Importantly, Burke emphasizes that identification is only possible because there is division. It is, in other words, compensatory to division. He noted, "If men were not apart from one another, there would be no need for the rhetoric expression to proclaim their unity. In Burke's framework, identification creates what he calls consubstantiality, a sharing of substance between speaker and audience. So to identify A with B is to make A consubstantial with B. So Burke's identification then is fundamentally social and rhetorical. It concerns how people connect with each other through symbolic means. It is a necessary and inevitable aspect of human communication. So this is in contrast to Korzybski's use of the term identification, which refers to a semantic error or the confusion of different orders of abstraction. In his definition, identification represents a primitive characteristic that leads to maladjustment. So Korzybski emphasized that identification is semantic disturbance, and his concern with it was primarily epistemological and psychological. So despite these differences in conceptualizing identification, there's fascinating intersection between these theories. So Burke's insight that rhetoric operates through identification helps explain why semantically unhygienic communication can be so persuasive. The very process that Burke identifies as central to persuasion often requires the semantic collapse that Korzybski warned against. So when you consider Obama's 2004 DNC speech, he declared, "There's not a liberal America and a conservative America, there's the United States of America," end quote. So this quote exemplifies this idea of identification. And President Trump's efforts at identification have been greatly successful through his powerful use of division. So it's clear that understanding both Burkean identification and Korzybskian identification provides valuable tools for analyzing contemporary political rhetoric. So by examining how these different conceptions function in the speeches of figures like Trump and Obama, we gain insight into both the power and potential dangers of political language in our complex, multi-valued world. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Yana. I really appreciate that. Very insightful on those connections. So our next speaker is Tiffany Petricini from Pennsylvania State University at Erie, and the title of her talk is Using Korzybski to Understand AI Framing and Analysis of Cultural Discourse. Tiffany.
Thanks, Corey. I'm excited because I think there are some connections here. I heard the word framing, I heard Burke, and I was like, oh, this is going to lead very nicely into the talk. So just sort of a quick introduction. I am an associate teaching professor in communication studies, and I am very, very immersed and interested in the AI space. And this project came about because I was a part of the Science and Sanity book club. And as we were reading the text together, I was trying to make sense of real world applications of the ideas and use them to sort of figure out problems. And so one of the problems that I recognized was that we have a lot of language, a lot of phrases, and a lot of terms to sort of talk about our relationship to AI. So the thought processes that we have. And so AI isn't just a technology, it's a rhetorical and it's a media phenomenon. And what this talk tries to do is blend media ecology, like most of the talks today, media ecology and general semantics to make sense of the actual language that we are using to describe what AI does to us, what it does to the society, and how we go about regulating and even adopting it. So I just stuck to 3 terms for my paper and 3 terms for today. And those terms are cognitive offloading, augmented intelligence, and co-intelligence. So my original project was to try to create a thread that traced all of these different ways of using words to describe not just the AI relationship that we have, but the technology relationship that we have, and it got out of hand quickly. So I decided just to focus on these 3 terms. And another thing that I wanted to sort of think through that I was noticing related to these terms is that AI can be framed in different ways. And so in one of my book chapters with my research team, we looked at the way that students and faculty use different frames of describing AI. So for example, in some instances, it's more than human. In some instances, it's just a tool. In some instances, it is like human, it's anthropomorphized. And so there are consequences to framing AI as a tool or a partner or an autonomous force. And these environments, they shape the technology and they shape their perception and their cognition and then the policy. So like I said, I used a general semantics approach, and then I sort of combined it and meshed it together with the media ecology approach. One thing that I did not tease out, but I really want to try to work through, is something that we talked about at ECA and something that we talked about in the book club. And that's the idea that general semantics is not a rhetorical approach. And so, general semantics has differences. And so a lot of the ideas that I was trying to think through at a more broad scale level are rhetorical, and they're already part of the rhetoric of technology and studies that have sort of looked at that. So for example, deterministic screens, we have Carolyn Miller and the idea of technological neutrality, and the concept of technical neutrality being problematic. So from a rhetorical perspective, AI terminology, it causes groups of individuals and groups of people and society at large to focus their attention on certain possibilities while obscuring others. So I talk about that today, and I also try to talk about it from a more general semantics approach. But like I said, I did not tease out the differences yet between which is which, which is actually general semantics and which is more rhetorical. So I now want to ask you, and you can type in chat, you're welcome to. Nobody's talked in chat yet. I'm watching. What do you think when you think of the term cognitive offloading? What are your thoughts about this word? What are you thinking? Cognitive offloading. You don't have to type in chat. You can just think about it. I want to see at least some of the answers. Freeloading. Oh, thank you, Lance. Yes. Oh, Andy Clark. Yes. Corey, I remember when we were first working on actually just our thoughts and working out our thoughts, we talked about cognitive offloading and Andy Clark and Chalmers too at that time. So Robert, I will define it. So cognitive offloading, from the etymological stance, we can break it down and we can look at the Latin derivative, conocere. I don't know how to speak Latin, so I'm doing my best, which means to get to know. And the word offload was actually a term that has its roots in the shipping industry. Cargo literally had to be thrown off of vessels to reduce the load so ships wouldn't sink. And so that term offloading was sort of manifested and developed over time at this level to indicate like taking some part of knowing and throwing it overboard, right? And so it was first applied in psych and human computer interaction to start describing the use of tools to reduce mental effort. Okay, what about co-intelligence now? Co-intelligence, what do you think of when you hear the word co-intelligence? Oh, let me open back up chat. Oh, Michelle, two heads are better than one. Okay, that is the recent rhetoric. So, okay, John, yeah, right. Awesome, yeah, interesting. The AI is not intelligent. So AI plus human, yeah, Laura, yep. Cooperative intelligence, yes. So I'm gonna switch now. Co, of course, prefix from Latin meaning together. Intelligence means to understand. So this would essentially mean to understand together. So what was interesting was that this term originally was coined to understand group collaboration. So human to human to human collaboration, but we've extended it to the process of human AI thought. So there are implications for that, which we'll get into. So the final term here, augmented intelligence. What are some of the things that you think of when you hear the term the phrase augmented intelligence? Enhanced. Okay, that's very interesting, Awesome, because I thought something different. And then as I did the research, yeah, assisted. Yeah, I agree, assisted. Augmented intelligence. Oh, prolific reader. Changed, yeah. So that's what I really was assuming was the idea of changed intelligence. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So when it comes to augmented intelligence, the Latin augmentare, again, I don't know if I'm saying that right, was it had the meaning to increase or enhance. And so it actually means support and not replacement. So the idea of change was my initial reaction to that term. This ultimately became popularized by Douglas Engelbart in the 1960s, and I'm tracing computational thinking right now from the time of Peter Ramus until today. And so Engelbart is a really, really key player in that. So the idea that he suggested the term augmented intelligence, and it's been picked up so prominently in our world today, is really important. So I will tell you, when I heard the term cognitive offloading, I kind of took Lance's perspective. To me, I was sort of like I had a moral reaction, a semantic reaction, like laziness. Are people going to think that I'm offloading things to AI, that I'm lazy, that I don't want to do the hard work of thought? When it came to co-intelligence, I also didn't prefer that term because it seemed to mean that we could create intelligence together with a machine, that together we created one intelligence. And I wasn't liking that term. And then from a standpoint of thinking through augmented intelligence, I also did not like that term because I thought that the implications of this term may be more fear in the population. So they may think not positively, but it would change or alter humans. And so it was a bad thing. So this is where I started using the structural differential. Now, I listened to everybody today, and there's different layers or different ways of thinking about the structural differential. And I'm new enough to this that I know that this doesn't match what everybody had today. So it makes sense to me, but I'm open at the end, of course, to have conversation and maybe suggestions about this. So if we just think about AI and the structural differential, at this nonverbal, very raw level, there are actual processes that no human can explain. There are things that go on with AI that even programmers can't explain. And so I would consider that to be the nonverbal level, the event level. And then at the more object level, this is the labeling level. So we might say something like what we're experiencing or what we're seeing is user interaction with AI outputs. The descriptive level is where the terms would come in. So for example, co-intelligence. And at the inferential level, these are the actual, inferences of using the terms that we're using. And so they have actual semantic implications for individuals who use the word. They have more broader societal implications. So these would be the emotional and cultural meanings. So for example, the feeling of awe or the feeling of fear. So, I skipped ahead. So I tried to look at first cognitive offloading and break this down. So the nonverbal level is still the same. It's AI algorithms, these systems of mathematized language in nth dimensional space that we can't sort of grasp. At the object level, an example of this would be offloading your schedule and writing things down or remembering things to a scheduling app. So the descriptive would be cognitive offloading. And then the inferential level of this is that, we have this level of trust. This is just one. There are other inferential levels of sort of thinking through this. So we can do the same with augmented intelligence. Again, it's these AI processes in nth dimensional space that we don't really have the capability of understanding, that nobody can. And then at the object level, again, this human AI interaction. So then we have the descriptive level, so augmented intelligence. And then the inferential level, one way that we might see it, and some of you even commented about this, is that it's seen as enhancing, empowering. But this language, for example, can obscure the risks of automation. So finally, I did the same thing with co-intelligence. So again, the algorithms, the unseen, the things that we just don't have the actual language to explain and understand truly. Then the object level, these experiences that we're having, co-intelligence, this idea of some type of shared cognition. And then finally, at the inferential level, we kind of, when we use co-intelligence, view AI as a partner or co-creator. And this is a problem because it impacts our sense of agency and what we think about agency, just one sort of approach to this. So when we take the media plus the language, we're getting out of this cultural reality. And so when we use terminology like thinking machines or co-creators, this is changing how we use AI and how we interact with AI. So not only is it at a personal level, but this also frames institutional level reactions and interactions. So there are implications for this, and I don't have answers, but I'm curious. I keep thinking, what would Korzybski say? Should AI terms be standardized? How do metaphors shape public trust and policy? I'm working on that one right now. And can we actually avoid anthropomorphism when we ourselves are the center of all language that we use? And that's what we use to make sense of the world. Some other implications that I've been thinking about is how policymakers use the language, like high-risk AI. The European Union has a really good way of breaking this down, but the language is still very abstract, high-risk AI. So we really, really need semantic clarity because all of these misleading terms have a big impact on, curriculum design, policy creation, and AI integration. And so where I'm moving towards and trying to really tease out is a general semantics approach. It would argue that language needs to actually reveal and not obscure the technological function. We need to be critical of the terms that we're using, and the discourse and the actual language that we're using should reflect the actual realities of AI. So that's it. I was trying to squeeze it in there as fast as possible. I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Again, very stimulating, so much to think about there. And so let me turn to our next speaker here. This is Ryan McCullough at West Liberty University, and the title of his talk is "The Model is the Message, the Structural Differential as a Medium." Ryan?
All right, thank you. So can everyone hear me? Okay, my computer froze for a second. Am I being heard?
Yes, Ryan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sorry. Let me just say thank you, Corey, thank you, Lance, thank you, Institute of General Semantics, for allowing me to be here. I also just want to let everyone know that I'm kind of working through some of these ideas. I'm sorry if anything that I say kind of seems obvious or taken for granted. So as you can probably tell, given the title of my talk, the model is the message, the structural differential as medium, that this paper obviously has connections with media ecology. So this paper starts from three principles. So first, I accept Marshall McLuhan's principle that the medium is the message. The form medium of communication shapes the content of communication. We cannot divide content from medium. Second, I accept Neil Postman's precept that the medium is the metaphor. Every medium of communication has resonance and can alter patterns of thinking and acting beyond itself. As he demonstrated in Amusing Ourselves, television had resonance beyond the screen, and in Technopoly, technical thinking, produced by a litany of technologies, wound its way into all spheres of culture. And the third premise is I embrace an expansive definition of medium. So I accept Lance Strain's principle that's articulated in Media Ecology, an approach to understanding communication, or understanding the human condition, that we can have an expansive definition of medium, and this expansive definition can include symbols, signs, innovations, and or techniques. So from these principles, I argue that essentially that the structural differential created by Alfred Korzybski in Science and Sanity constitutes a medium. And we can think of the structural differential as a symbol and a sign that represents the process of abstraction. By representing the process of abstraction, the structural differential innovates our use of language, understanding of communication, and interactions with others. From this innovation, new methods and techniques of understanding language and the process of abstraction emerge. The structural differential consequently resonates beyond the field of linguistics. language studies, and even beyond general semantics itself. It brings forward a different way of, and I apologize to some for the allusion to phenomenology, being in the world. Contact with the structural differential brings implications to all areas of human interaction. It forms an environment unto itself, an environment of general semantics, and it offers hope as a counter environment that serves as a bulwark against a larger digital media environment. As Straight also indicates, media ecology asks us when considering communication, language, and for the purposes of this symposium, consciousness and culture, to think about the consequences of a medium before anything else. As such, and from this argument, this paper thinks through the implications of the structural differential as a medium and considers the environment it forms and the ways we communicate about communication. So this paper essentially will make 3 movements. So first, I will work through my initial or my semantic reactions to the general scope and telos of general semantics, and how one can work through those reactions by focusing on deliberate and systematic nature of general semantics. Second, I'll discuss the centrality of the structural differential as a medium that resonates by drawing our attention to deliberate and systematic thinking and understanding the world by making things complicated. So the structural differential is complicated and makes our thinking about the world complicated. And then third, I hope to show, or I discuss the implications of these complications, right, to the study of communication, to the study of media or media ecology, and potentially slow media and slow communication. So I'm going to start with what was always or has kind of been my kind of difficulty in terms of understanding journal semantics. So I'm going to start with this quote by Wendell Johnson. It is in the deliberate and systematic concern with techniques of inquiry that one might most readily find the distinguishing features of general semantics and the degree of promise it holds for the emancipation of from the future misfortunes of the past in our own lives individually and in that cooperative adventure men call civilization. Now, one might read these lines as an exercise in modernity. Johnson seems concerned with the idea that through general semantics, one can achieve some form of personal liberation. Or if societies begin to apply the principles of general semantics, then they will learn from past mistakes and bring us into a new and glorious future. The notion of freeing the individual to make the world over has been well documented as one of the goods of modernity and the tyranny of individualism. Passing readings of Johnson's words might get hung up on the idea of general semantics as a technique of inquiry. A technique of inquiry calls to mind a rules articulation of technique, right? So general semantics offers a method or procedure for understanding language in relation to others, and a concern for preoccupation with method and procedure might smack of this notion of technique. Now, Neil Postman describes general semantics in the work of Alfred Korzybski as, quote, a way towards humane and scientific method of ordinary discourse. This shifts the focus to means, not necessarily ends, which is one of Ellul's primary concerns. While Postman might have had some modernist impulses, the fundamental belief that a system of thinking and study could lead to a better way and a better world shocks those who come to general semantics from a postmodernist viewpoint, right? Postmodernity invites skepticism towards the meta-narrative of science and rationalism, right? That's Lyotard. Moreover, those who come to general semantics from the perspective of media ecology, the idea that one could use this method to bring a better world might worry or might kind of bring to the idea of a preoccupation with the method of general semantics falls into the mental shortcuts found in technique. To be perfectly honest, these were my initial responses to general semantics when introduced to the work of Alfred Korzybski through Postman. Now, this was where we admit the dangers of our semantic reactions. If anything, looking back at Ryan McCullough, and I'll time date myself in 2017, I feel somewhat embarrassed by these reactions. Granted, I did consider myself well-read in media ecology, thanks to an excellent graduate education. But being well-read does not mean that a person can read and react to what he, she, or they encounter with skill and aplomb. Given the nature of graduate education, I kind of had a built-in tendency to think about and respond to every idea, not just with a skepticism, but with an orientation towards argumentation. So going back, so while technique might not be the appropriate way to describe general semantics, what I do want to focus on, and the emphasis here, is the notion of deliberate and systematic do speak to the core of what general semantics does to individual patterns of thinking and ways of interpreting the world. Deliberate, the adjectives, reminds us to deliberate the verb. General semantics reminds us to engage in careful consideration of the language we use. And we can see this in the three major principles of general semantics, right? The principle of non-identity, the principle of non-allness, and the principle of self-reflexiveness. Now, there are many, extensional devices that one can use, but I want to turn our attention specifically to the centrality of structural differential and the notion that the structural differential is a complicated idea, right? So I'm going to quote here from Korzybski, and this is from the third edition. If any reader realizes his difficulties and seriously wants to overcome them, another suggestion may be given. The structural diagram in the present work, called the structural differential, shows the structural difference between the world of animal and the world of man. Excuse the typo there. This structural difference is not yet fully realized. Now, while Korzybski uses the term diagram instead of model, the structural differential offers a representation of the deliberate and systematic way in which general semantics moves beyond our initial instincts brought to us by Aristotelian systems. The structural differential offers a representation of the principles of non-identity, non-allness, and self-reflexiveness. So the supposed clarity of the model, as Korzybski diagrams, it serves as a constant reminder that of all the principles of general semantics. One of the things that I do want to emphasize is I always go back to Neil Postman when he describes the structural differential as a comical, curious mobile. Now, John talked about earlier the importance of viewing the structural differential in three dimensions rather than kind of the flat representation that we find in our text. But I want to emphasize that complication provides value. Complication means that things do not appear as simple as they seem. General semantics reminds us to disassociate objects from the idea of stability. As I write this, my coffee cup on my desk moves. It appears stationary, but we know that on an atomic level, the atoms that make up the mug collide with one another. We know that this cup actually exists as an event. Things happen that I cannot see. The world moves, but that movement becomes imperceptible as I sit in my office and I speak now or when I wrote these words. The complication of the structural differential, if not a primitive image in a three-dimensional mobile, will move. The mobile will twist and turn, sway back and forth. Consequently, aside from offering a full view of the process of abstraction, the structural differential serves as a reminder of our complicated world. The world exists as events, and our process of abstraction occur constantly. My eyes and ears might simplify things, but with the structural differential in mind, I can keep events separated from one another. The world appears simple, complications exist, and the structural differential ushers forth this particular idea. Now, as I'm kind of closing for time, I just want to bring up three kind of implications from this idea of thinking about the complications and the value of complication within the structural differential. First, right, it reminds us that communication becomes an event, right? And so if we're thinking about culture, communication, and consciousness, right, when we think about or think through issues of communication, we might want to keep in mind Postman's idea of the semantic environment, right? And we examine communication as an event, and that also invites what Postman calls, context analysis, right? Secondly, this has implications for, and I think it provides the idea of, or speaks to the notion of media ecology as general semantics writ large, right? The idea of the structural differential resonates as we think through and as we complicate ideas as they relate to media and media ecology, right? It allows us to kind of think beyond simply divide of content and communication, right? It allows us to kind of think of things holistically and occurring as an event. And then finally, because of its complications, it invites the notion of slow communication and slow media. In a world that asks us to move quickly, right? The structural differential and its complications invites us to slow down. And as we slow down, we can better, I hate to use the word process, but I'll use the word process. We can better understand the complicated world that is in front of us. And that is my talk. So I'm excited to hear, and if I'm repeating anything that is very clearly or blatantly obvious, I'd be excited to hear your feedback and your ideas.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. Again, very, very interesting. Appreciate all that. And I'm sure we have questions here in a second. But before we get to our questions part, our final speaker in this session is Laura Trujillo, and her from Universidad Panamericana in Mexico, host of the upcoming MEA this summer here, people. So please get that on your list as well. But the title of her talk is From Structural Differential to Aristotelian Wisdom, Exploring Perception and the Process of Knowing. Laura?
Yes, thank you very much, Corey, and thank you for reminding us the Media Ecology Convention. So everyone is invited. Please come to Mexico. It's going to be amazing. So if you have any doubt about it, you can call me or you can write me an email. So the title of my presentation is From a Structural Differential to Aristotelian Wisdom, a Philosophical Response. In the pursuit of knowledge, Aristotle and Alfred Korzybski represent two profoundly different yet intersecting approaches to understanding the world. While Aristotle, the ancient realist, defined knowledge as a grasp of causes and essence, Korzybski, a 20th century thinker, proposed that knowledge is not of things themselves, but of the structural abstractions formed through neurolinguistic processes. Despite being separated by more than 2 millennia, both intellectuals were driven by a shared concern, the improvement of human understanding and behavior through a deeper comprehension of language and cognition. This presentation highlights their key points of agreement and divergence, with a special emphasis on Aristotle's philosophical response to Korzybski's general semantics. Aristotle believed that true knowledge is the understanding of causes. His epistemological framework is famously articulated through the theory of the four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. To truly know something, one must grasp its essence, defined as the unchanging form that makes a thing what it is. For example, we recognize an object as a chair not merely because of its material or physical characteristics, but because it possesses an intelligible form that corresponds to our concept of chairness. This process of identifying what something is central to Aristotelian realism. In works such as Physics, Metaphysics, and On the Soul, Aristotle emphasizes that knowledge is attainable through the senses, refined by memory and experience, and perfected by rational understanding of universal truths. In contrast, Alfred Korzybski asserts that human beings never access the thing in itself, but only abstract structures filtered through our nervous and linguistic systems. In his seminal work, Science and Sanity, he proposes that our understanding of reality is always mediated by language and neurophysiology. His structural differential model visually represents the abstraction process. Beginning with an event, we selectively perceive aspects of it to form a sensory object, label it, verbally and build further abstractions. He famously states, "The map is not the territory," emphasizing that our descriptions and perceptions are always incomplete representations. For Korzybski, knowledge is not about accessing ultimate truths, but about creating functional models that help us adapt, survive, and communicate. Despite their methodological differences, both thinkers recognize the fundamental role of language in shaping thought. Aristotle was the first to systematically study logic and develop a formal system of reasoning, the organon, which laid the foundation for centuries of philosophical and scientific discourse. Logic, for Aristotle, is not a science in itself, but a preparatory tool for the sciences. It enables the construction of arguments, the detection of fallacies, and the alignment of language with reality. Korzybski also underscores the centrality of language, but criticizes Aristotelian logic as being elementalist, arguing that logic artificially separates phenomena that are intertwined in experience. His concern is not only logical precision, but also psychological well-being. The misuse of language, he argues, leads to semantic confusion and mental disorder. Where they most clearly part ways is in their conception of truth and reality. For Aristotle, truth is the adequation between the intellect and the think. Veritas est adequatio rei et intellectus. In this view, knowledge is a process of aligning the mind with the essential structures of the world. The intellect is capable of receiving the form of the object without its matter, as stated in the Anima. In contrast, Korzybski insists that there is no direct access to reality. Instead, our nervous systems and languages create larger abstractions of experience. Truth, in this framework, is not correspondence, but functionality. A true statement is one that works effectively in practice. From an Aristotelian perspective, the key refutations to Korzybski's framework are as follows. Number one, unknowing essence. Korzybski denies the possibility of knowing things in themselves, claiming that all knowledge is a construction. Aristotle would counter that while perception and abstraction involve stages, the intellect can indeed grasp the form, the essence of things. Knowledge is not merely practical or linguistic, but ontological. It reveals what a thing truly is. Number two, on causality. Korzybski rejects Aristotelian causality, particularly the final cause, as unscientific and metaphysical. Aristotle, however, sees the four causes as explanatory principles necessary for understanding the world. The final cause, purpose, or end is especially evident in biology, where functions such as the heart's pumping of blood cannot be understood without reference to purpose. Number three, on binary logic. Korzybski argues that Aristotelian logic is too rigid and fails to capture the fluidity of real-life experience. Aristotle would respond that the principle of non-contradiction, the foundation of binary logic, is indispensable for any rational discourse. Without it, distinction between true and false, useful and harmful, coherent and incoherent would collapse. Even Korzybski's own evaluations rely in some logical consistency. Number 4, on language and thought. Korzybski stresses that language should not be confused with reality and warns against identification errors. Aristotle agrees, but sees language as a tool that, when used properly through logic, allows us to approach truth. The organon helps refine our use of terms, propositions, and categories to minimize confusion and improve clarity. Korzybski's theory is valuable for reminding us of the limits of perception, the layers of abstraction in communication, and the ethical responsibility of language users. His emphasis on self-awareness, flexibility, and empathy makes his work especially relevant to education, mental health, and intercultural dialogue. However, his rejection of essentialism and objective truth poses challenges to scientific inquiry and philosophical rigor. Without a stable reference point, the very act of evaluating true claims becomes problematic. Aristotle's realism affirms that while human knowledge is imperfect, it is oriented toward truth. Through sense perception, abstraction, logical reasoning, and empirical investigation, the intellect can progressively approach universal truths. His ethical and epistemological systems are based on the conviction that reality is intelligible and that the human mind, though fallible, is capable of grasping its principles. In conclusion, the dialogue between Aristotle and Korzybski, even if imagined across time, reveals the richness of philosophical inquiry. Korzybski challenges us to be humble, critical, and attentive to the structures of language and abstraction. Aristotle reminds us that truth and essence are not illusions, but goals worthy of pursuit. Rather than choosing between them, we might integrate their insights to acknowledge the limitations of language and perception, while still striving for reasoned, coherent, and meaningful knowledge. In a world increasingly marked by relativism, rapid information flow, and ideological polarization, Aristotle's realism offers a grounding perspective. It insists that beyond appearances and abstractions, there is something real to be known. Knowledge, then, is both a map, as Korzybski would say, and a journey toward reality, as Aristotle would affirm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Again, very rich talk. And so for folks here, I think we do have sufficient time for discussion. Who would like to open the floor here? Who'd like to raise the first question here for us? Yeah, Aldo? You're muted.
I've been curious about something for a while now, since I've become interested in phenomenology and brain science. The idea of abstracting seems to be a first-person capacity. And to become conscious of this capacity implies that it was not conscious to begin with. Is that correct? Number one. If in fact that is correct and abstracting is subliminal in some way, my question is it primordial? Is it something that is built into the organism in the first place so that first person abstracting becomes possible? Because I don't think it can be done in a group. We do it individually, So what does it have to do with our capacities that are innate and that need to be discovered in the way becoming conscious of abstracting implies?
Or panelists want to get at that? I mean, I would just say really quickly, I think some of it gets very difficult when you overgeneralize. Like, Korzybski's a little quick to overgeneralize, at least when he talks about consciousness of abstracting. I think when you get to the particulars, especially as you move media ecology in, you start to realize that we're talking about differences between the sensory modalities. That is the sense modality of sight versus hearing versus touch, taste. Like each one becomes a disclosure of the limitations of the others. And then collectively, we can talk about, again, sort of consciousness of abstracting by, recognizing the integration, but also the loss as you translate from one to the other.
Okay, I agree with that. But if I'm an artist and I do abstract painting, and I'm trying to teach people to get more out of what is abstract by looking at an abstract composition. So they need to find a way to make meaning out of it and to get to the core of what is the feeling process that has to do with it. Every artist says you have to feel it. You have to feel it, as if the construction of meaning must include some feeling. So when I talk about abstracting and looking at an abstract painting and finding what it is that I feel and allowing it to have memories surface and have other feelings that are embodied and so on, things that I may have blocked or somehow put aside in order to develop as a human being, I want those things to come back. I want to have a deeper appreciation for art by having a deeper feeling when I'm observing art. And in my musician days, I looked at playing jazz as spontaneous creativity. And that was all abstract. It was totally abstract, instantaneous. You're playing, you're creating at the same time. Now, if that's not a form of abstracting, I don't know what is. That's abstracting in the flesh. So I think I may be asking the question in a way that is not particularly satisfying to um, to general semanticists, but I've also been interested in NLP and in other forms of embodiment before the word even came up, before Lakoff and Johnson were even talking about this, because I was also for 10 years in New York working as a body psychotherapy, Reichian work, where emotions would come up in people, followed by memory trace, which proved to me something's got to be locked in that block to bring consciousness to their new feelings, their new ways of getting into the depths of their personal organism. So if you know anything about Reich, and I'm sure a lot of you do, there's a lot to poo-poo, but there's also a lot of significant real expressions, real experiences. It almost leads me to believe that expression and experience happen instantaneously and are spontaneous. So where do I go with this feeling, with this idea? Just a question.
Can I answer or offer a partial answer to this question? I don't know if this is helpful. So, I think of and so I'm not an artist, but I think of some of the work by Pierre Bourdieu and his discussion of distinction, right? And that and discussion of what we might call artistic taste. Bourdieu talks about the ways in which that these are culturally produced, right? Our distinctions of what we think to be good, bad, judgments, those things are inherently cultural products. And so what I would say, at least what I think maybe what my talk attempted to do, and maybe others might agree or disagree, is that the process of abstraction, right, and the way in which we abstract can be slowed down and processed in such a way that we don't have to rely on solely culturally produced reactions to the things that that integrate or that we encounter. So again, the way that I draw this to the analogy I draw out is like, well, my initial reaction to general semantics is like, okay, is this just another way that we can make a better world? And I kind of view that with a degree of skepticism, but actually looking at it and thinking through it and processing what I'm reading here, rather than simply taking an argumentative stance, which was kind of given to me, the type of education that I have, then we're able to slow down our responses. So when I hear like the notion of impulses, right, I think that these things do come to us from time, place, location, and culture, and I think Bourdieu's work speaks to that idea. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's how I might make kind of process your question, and I hope that's helpful.
Can I respond before another question? It seems to me that because of music, and that's my orientation, when someone listens to a symphony or any other type of music, especially music that is played behind some kind of story on television or in the movies, that music that's being played is so immediate that when it hits the organism, let's call it the organism, because it's more than just trying to contemplate, well, is that a B flat or is that a C? That's I'm talking about way beyond there. When the human organism hears music, it is spontaneous. To me, it's an experience and an expression simultaneously, which leads me to what is the bodily reality as we talk about embodiment. Do things get embodied? Or do we have the capacity to embody? If I look at a work of art and I'm thinking to myself, geez, I'm not getting much of this. If you know that vision and feeling are so much connected in all of the writings of Merleau-Ponty, feeling is everything. So if you can actually point to what you're looking at on a piece of art and you can touch it, the implication is that you can learn more about it and you can access feelings, subtle as they may be, but you have to be open to that. This is an ontological question. This says, can I be open to this? Open to my own self within my contact with this piece of art, no matter what it is. It could be awful, but can you make a contact with it? Can it represent something to you? Is it possible to recognize the capacity for abstracting by doing this? And the question remains, is the capacity the original way of finding and making meaning before it becomes first person? It's about learning. Have I learned how I abstract, and can I continue to abstract in that way in an effort to continue to learn?
I mean, I think part of the difficulty here is that I think we are slipping around, and maybe this is a way to go to some of the things Jana was talking about with this connection between Burke and Korzybski, because I think in some way, although it seems like we're trading back and forth between Korzybski's sort of rigorous definition of, organism realizing that it has a nervous system and that what it's experiencing is somehow filtered through that nervous system, which is very different than I think the kind of abstraction that we want to talk about where the artist gives a rendering and strategically omits in order to, and I think what you're talking about is really a form of identification. And I think for me, the common connection between Burke and Korzybski is you got to go to people like Fraser and Freud. So like when Fraser wrote Golden Bough, I mean, he basically laid out all of these different kinds of magic practices where people would identify with forms of contagion or forms of similarity. And then, Freud picks this up when he writes Totem and Taboo. Book could have been called What I Learned from Sir James George Fraser. And then Korzybski and Burke both react very different to that tradition, whereas Burke sees resources for identification in artistic creations, and exactly what you're sort of talking about, this feeling that can be conveyed through the abstractions. I think Korzybski saw it as a premature form of reasoning and as an inadequate sensibility for the establishment of science.
So when you become conscious of it, you have a greater capacity to put everything together or to see things that you haven't seen before. They're up there in the parabola someplace, right?
Burke argues that dance majors are the most equipped to grasp the essence of something. That they're the most conscious of their abstracting. So says Burke. He claims dance students.
And I would claim that it's jazz musicians. However, one of the things that I'd also like to enter this, you said take Freud or take somebody else. When you talk about Freud, and nowadays when we talk about the ego and its embodiment, there's a tricky thing going on with the ego actually being the mechanism of volition. So we got to think in terms, some psychological terms that are going on with our need to have purpose, our need to have representational thought, divorced in space and time, out there someplace, and that's where abstraction happens the most, at least for me. I mean, does anybody, when they're abstracting, do their abstracting with the elements of space and time, or are they out someplace else?
No, those are good. So is everybody, I mean, people can follow up on this, but do we have questions here for our presenters? Do we have somebody else?
Sorry, I went overboard here.
How about questions for our presenters here?
You know, I wanted to say that I like the fact that metaphor came up for Tiffany and Ryan, you know, I think that is very, very important idea. And, you know, what is the metaphor? And certainly Postman put together metaphor map models, you know, that these are all, you know, kind of different aspects of the same thing. And so what is the metaphor, for example, involved in artificial intelligence, Tiffany, and what would you say to that?
I think that's part of the problem that there's just so many different ways to answer that question, and it's so subjective. And that's where I think Korzybski is really good to get us reflecting on that subjectiveness. I don't know though. I one of the things that I'm looking at, I didn't include it in this talk, but as I'm looking through computational thinking and the evolution of this, so back in the 60s, I think it was the 60s, Licklider, some of you will recognize his name. So Licklider, he started using the term human, or I think it was man-machine symbiosis, but now they've altered it to human-machine symbiosis. You know, and that ultimately, that's the problematic part, I think, that it all goes back to either saying that there's two frames. It's either us conjoined or us versus. So us with or us conjoined with or us versus is giving us a dichotomy that isn't the reality of it. It's like when it used to be online versus offline communication, and that was pitted against it, you know, against each other. So you have online friends and offline friends. It was really problematic. That research was problematic because it didn't reflect the realities of how people truly interacted with each other, you know.
Well,
and I feel like, yeah, so sorry, yeah.
Yeah, but what about, you know, if we follow media ecology, then the metaphor is the environment, rather than looking at AI as a thing, you know, thinking about it as a new context environment.
Yeah, so I guess this kind of flows into the formal cause presentation, and also a presentation that I just gave at the Orality Literacy Conference, and that is it's not AI. So I keep trying to harp. I'm using AI today, and I know that I used that term, but ultimately what our environment consists of is algorithmic influence that we don't have control over. And I feel like this is the first time that we're not able to opt out of it. So our life right now, what we see, what we interact with, how we interact with others, even if we are not using technology, it is the result of algorithmic influence. And so I want to be cautious about using the term AI, because it's like the difference between, I think I said this to you, it's like the difference between using a phone versus understanding the rules about what make that phone work, and the social rules about the proper way and improper way to use that. So I guess maybe I would direct us to the idea of algorithmic influence as the broader way of thinking about this, that would be more helpful at a human level. I don't know that that answered your question.
Good. It's a good answer.
Yeah.
Anyone else here? Yes.
Question for Ryan. When you said, Ryan, structural differential creates a counter environment, I wondered what you mean, if you could say a bit more on that.
Yeah, so I think I kind of and I might be playing a little bit fast and loose here with the term counter environment. I'll admit it for the purposes of this talk, but I think about it as something that is, if you will, kind of not larger digital media environment or larger television environment, and that's kind of what Neil Postman was thinking about, is that it is something other than, and I think maybe Lance's talk earlier kind of got this to this, right? Is if we're thinking about that we're in an environment that allows for, or that focuses on, as he called it, right, stimulation, right, and then we have stimulation and response, right? The structural differential, I think, through the kind of its complicated formulation, right? And I view it as, maybe others see it much more simply, but I think about it like in contrast to Shannon Weaver model, right? And so if you teach public speaking, you show probably a version of the Shannon Weaver model where it's very quickly for the students to recognize, okay, sender, receiver, or if you think about the transactional model, right, I'm both a sender and a receiver, right? So I can embody both of those things, and that's helpful for a discussion within public speaking, right? And I'm not valorizing Shannon Weaver, but I think it's helpful in that context, in the sense that it helps students think about communication other than what they are saying. It forces them to think about audience members and others, right? So if I were to draw the analogy out, right, I think that the complications of this model, right, just reminds us that things are more complicated than they seem, and if things are more complicated than they seem, that might invite the ability to, I don't know, maybe pay attention to things that we might not normally pay attention to, or listen to things that we might not normally listen to. So I guess if that's not an accurate definition of counter environment, I apologize, but I think about it as something that is, or that is as a model, if you will, or a diagram. And I know Lance talks about it's not a model of communication per se, right? But we can. It is a model that communicates something about communications. It's meta communicative, and I think that's where the value lies.
So it's more like a meta environment.
I think that could be, if I were to tease this paper out a little bit more, maybe.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much for this very stimulating session. I can thank our presenters again. And we're going to take a 10-minute recess between this and our next session. So feel free to go get a coffee, get a water, get whatever you need, and we will return.